Neville, have you read Revolt of the Public?
No, I generally am very bad about reading any books about anything contemporary. Is that about something new or recent?
Ish. I mean, I think it was written originally in 2014, which actually makes it seem extremely prescient. Came out in a Stripe Press edition, so maybe you should make an exception for anything from Stripe Press.
Yeah, no, it's a general interest thing. It's not a pejorative. Like, I love the sound of an individual, right? But it's just a general interest thing. You go back to the headline.
But all the things you're talking about, right? The big split being between essentially the institutions and authority, which are their credibility and their legitimacy is eroding, right? And then you have this revolt of the public, which is enabled by social media and Gurry, the author, credits social media as being the sort of like enabling force for people to have alternate ways of getting information, plus alternate ways of coordinating and organizing. But the problem is that the public has no actual leadership, no plan, no ideology, no theory, and so they become this like nihilistic force where all they can really do is destroy and tear down.
Yeah, to stretch an analogy there, it's a battlefield going on, and if you're individuals, you're basically all behaving like terrorists. You're just suicide bombers running around, trying to sneak behind enemy lines, shoot a few people, take some hostages. Whereas, like, the armed forces are obviously with the institutions. But then when someone like the New York Times tries to dock Scott Alexander or carries out a hit piece on him, that's like a tank going and blowing up an infantryman, right? Because they got the cavalry, they got the big guns, now they're facing guerrilla warfare. Long term, they're going to lose. The story always ends the same way in history, but we don't know if they lose the populists or the communists or the nationalists, right? None of those endings are great for anyone speaking in this room, by the way.
But what we get now is
that's what we're going at. It's a full-blown political war.
Yeah, we get these demonstrations that have by these groups of protesters who have no demands, right, or no specific demands, right? Like there's basically no way to win.
Like Occupy Wall Street and the Wall Street Bets crowd, and right,
exactly, and some other more recent ones.
So there's another hypothesis, Naval, to the adjacent to the revolt of the public hypothesis. And by the way, Naval, like that book basically is what you were describing. So that's the relevance. So there's another hypothesis that's somewhat overlapping but not the same, and it's actually something our friend Antonio, who I don't think is on right now, has been exploring a lot, which basically is like there's this theory basically that of sort of the nature of media and cultures. There's this guy Walter Ong who wrote this sort of classic book on the topic, and he sort of describes there's oral cultures and there's literate cultures. And historically, oral cultures, and most cultures historically have been oral cultures, including Western culture up until the printing press. And oral cultures, are characterized by, an enormous focus on like social coherence and compliance. They're focused on a huge amount of like, rumor and conspiracy theory. They're non-empirical. They're like emotion-based and sensation-based. So they're basically like, I don't know what you call it, like sort of non-rational in some sense, like social but not rational, or human and not rational, something like that. And then there's sort of literate cultures, and literate cultures, are kind of associated with the Enlightenment, right, which is kind of when they emerged. And literate cultures are basically, right, logic, rationality, facts, empiricism, right, method, principle, abstraction, right, which are all basically ideas that were created, to some extent by sort of this concept of literacy. But in fact, what's his name? Henrich, in his most recent book on Weird, actually talks about how people's brains actually change when they shift from an oral culture into a literate culture. And so Antonio's theory is like in the West, we were in an oral culture basically from inception through, about 300 years ago. We spent a, relatively brief period of time in a literate culture for the last 300 years. And now, sort of social media, the internet broadly is sort of cascading us back into an oral culture. And it's a little bit deceptive because, we're reading a lot of it, but the behavior patterns of social media are much more reminiscent of oral culture behaviors and literate culture behaviors. And so we're returning to sort of a different and pre-Enlightenment state.
That would be terrible if true. I hope that if that is first of all, on these massive shifts, I think 10 or 15 different things can be true. It's like trying to describe the macroeconomy, trying to describe geopolitical forces, like trying to describe the weather. There's just too many moving parts, and causality, you can stitch lots of narratives through, and they'll account in different proportions for what's going on. And given that nature is complex and nonlinear, right, it's very hard to see which one is the dominant factor. But let's suppose that hypothesis is correct. I think the countervailing force to that would be that since the Enlightenment, we've gotten used to things actually working, like iPhones compute. and cars drive and oil burns and things of that nature. So we've gotten used to things conforming with reality, with life getting better and technology advancing. And if you go to a cultural model in which technology stops working or stops advancing, if the Enlightenment stops, there will be hopefully at least some place in the world where that is still allowed, and that will just become the new breakthrough for technology and for science. Like, look at Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley drives so much of the innovation for the entire planet that it's literally unfair to everybody else, right? It's like, yeah, you all get to be vassals of Twitter and Google and Facebook and Amazon and Apple, and it's just too bad they happen to be based out of the West Coast of the United States, and the rest of you have the choice of either using incredibly inferior products or being swept up in our network effect. And so, but does that go away? Like if we shift, let's say that we shift to an oral dominant society, that's probably not going to happen everywhere at once at the same level, because there's going to be someone somewhere out there, the next Lee Kuan Yew, who will say, you know what, you can still come and build technology over here, because technology is leverage. It's the biggest force multiplier imaginable. So any nation that controls technology development or is the home for innovation technology will become the most powerful nation on earth eventually in a long enough timeline. So somebody somewhere is going to say, yeah, we want you to develop technology here. And as Matt Ridley wrote in his recent book, he said, innovation is a child of freedom and the parent of prosperity. So if you want prosperity, you need innovation. And if you want innovation, you have to have freedom. So someone's going to at least hopefully create enough freedom that all the technology development will go there. They will become the most powerful people on earth. And the oral tradition people are just going to lose because their views don't conform to reality and to technological progress. Even if no nation offers this freedom, then the technology development moves into the digital domain, which it kind of already has. I mean, most innovation in recent times has been software, not hardware, because it's less regulated. It moves in the digital domain onto blockchains and on the internet. So fundamentally, I do think that the hope for us remaining a merit-based society is our market forces imposed by things like blockchains. I don't think blockchains are like a feature of what's going on in technology today. I don't think it's like, oh, we've got blockchains and we've got VR and we've got AI and we've got SaaS and we've got like some drug development stuff. No, I think blockchains are really, really, really important. I think without blockchains working properly and decentralizing the platforms, we may end up in a bad cul-de-sac of history. But in some sense, I also view them as inevitable. At least what I've managed to game theory through, I do think they will win in the end. It's just a question of when. I view them as the third act of the internet. Act one was the web browser, pioneered by people like yourself. Act two was mobile, pioneered by Steve Jobs and crew. And now Act three, I think, is blockchains. And it's in plain sight, but it's so hard to understand. And it's so wrapped up in this whole idea of making money and get-rich-quick schemes and tokens that people just miss it. It's lying in plain sight, but it's so hard to follow that people just don't understand it. But I think it is literally as important to the internet's development as mobile phones were and as the web browser was.
So you're right about the idea that anybody who resists the folly of what we're calling the oral culture here would win game theoretically, but nothing says that we survive to that happening. We're now playing with processes at scale where the foolishness can take us all out. And as much as I also agree with you that market forces exert a kind of discipline on the system, one of the things I think what you said is accurate. Sometimes many things are true at once. And one of the things that's true here that I don't think gets enough attention is that we've taken lots of processes that are really important and plugged them too directly into the market. So the connection between the university and market forces has turned the thinking there low quality because the mechanisms necessary to do the thinking well are not tolerant to market forces. You could make the same argument for journalism. And so one of the lessons I think we need to learn very quickly is how to unplug certain things so their connection to the market is at least several steps removed.
Okay, but if they're not connected to the market, then what are they connected to? Because as far as I can tell, and I'm not trying to be difficult, I actually genuinely want to know, because all I've been able to come up with is either you connect to the market or you connect to natural forces, like, does this ball fall if I hold it up and drop it? But that's just the free market of nature. Or I connect to judgment by other people, architects telling, building buildings for architects, or journalists writing articles for journalists. Is there a fourth? I am not aware of it.
Yeah, the fourth is power. You're attached to power, right? Which is what the universities and the media companies have actually done, right? They're attached to power. They're attached to political power, which, by the way, then is, of course, the source of the funding, particularly for the universities.
Yeah, I guess what I'm saying is that I consider feedback from other people to eventually end up in the domain you're talking about, Mark, which is if you're not subject to natural forces of free markets, you end up controlled by people, and obviously end up controlled by the people in power. But I'm a little more optimistic. I actually don't think we're headed for a dark time. I view this as, yes, it will be very tumultuous, but I think the institutions are losing power by the day. Right? How many people now listen to Joe Rogan versus listen to CNN? That was unimaginable a decade ago. Substack with all these independent journalists, unimaginable. Twitter, where it is today, is still a much freer place for discussion in the comments section of any newspaper or even any newspaper website. So I actually think we're going through a tumultuous period, but our actual abilities to speak back and to see what is going on and to realize the truth is increasing. I'm not saying there aren't problems with the system, but I view the march of technology still as generally good and in the right direction, and certainly an intelligent individual can take advantage of it. And I think to the extent that you're an intelligent individual and you're counting on the masses to kind of align with your point of view, that's never going to happen, right? By definition, if you're intelligent, you're not part of the masses, and so you're kind of operating slightly outside of the system, not entirely within the system. If the whole system agrees with you and you agree with the system, then you're kind of an average person going to get average results. So I'm not that bummed about it. I just think it's all the way it has always been. In some ways, it's actually even improving for intelligent, capable individuals because they have more choice. There's a lot more freedom of choice and knowledge and capability brought about by the internet and by technology. So I'm cautiously optimistic. As long as we don't blow ourselves up, I think it all gets better. But there's always a chance of blowing ourselves up. But at least the current conflicts we're talking about, these are worst case secession and dissolution kind of conflicts. Those can be bloody, but they don't need nuclear weapons flying around.
Can we drill down on the limitations of the emerging order? I mean, we've talked a lot about, and I'm constantly in rooms where I hear people talk about journalists defecting from major mainstream institutions and starting their own Substacks. But the fact that newsrooms operate in a particular way, and that editors serve a particular function within these media organizations, and that even top flight journalists and opinionators, it's sort of an iron sharpeneth iron dynamic that is actually playing out there. There is a value to the way that institutions are organized, and they obviously emerged. So there is a decentralization, but there's also a reordering that's happening. And it seems necessarily true that if you're going to replicate some of these functions that are very necessary in terms of actually having a sophisticated investigative journalism capability or reporting capability, you actually need new institutions to emerge. And I've yet to see, I don't know what steps Substack is taking, for example, in terms of facilitating this sort of stuff. I do see some new publications that are leveraging the platform, but it certainly seems to me that new things are going to have to be built in order to replace these old things, and not merely people defecting and striking out on their own.
Well, the new things are, I don't think it goes to it doesn't go from the current institutions to a new set of institutions, right? I think it basically goes to an unlimited number of institutions. There will be one-man institutions, two-woman institutions, 3 people and a dog institutions, all the way up to the New York Times. It's going to be a big distributed power law curve of institutions, and people will be able to move around and switch around. That's why this whole idea of misinformation is nonsense. It's like no one agrees with anyone. No one can tell what's the truth. So they always say, point to the expert. Well, who are the experts? Someone appointed by Harvard. Great. Let me appoint people at Harvard. Now I am the expert of all news and of all power. So I think it's just going to be a large smattering of different kinds of institutions of different shapes and sizes, and they'll figure it out. I mean, editorial is not that hard. Let's be honest. You can hire an editor. You can bundle a Substack with 5 reporters together. So I don't think this is rocket science. I think it's actually quite doable. And we're going to look back in 5-10 years from now, and I think we will see the demise of most of our current media organizations. There might be a few left. They might not be the objective ones. They might be the partisan ones, right? It might be the New York Times, being used as a signaling mechanism across a large group of distributed institutions and individuals that are politically aligned with the people in power. And there might be a rebel alliance on the other side of people maybe a little more disparate, but also aligned through signaling mechanisms, umbrella institutions, editors stitching together journalists in between, etc. So I think we're going through a Cambrian explosion of media sources, right? Everyone is a media source. What the hell is this media organization right here that we have going? We've got 3, 6, 9, 12, 15 people in this room, who many of whom don't even know each other, talking about topics that are way beyond our quote-unquote expertise, which I'm sure someone in the press would love to attack us about. How dare they talk about journalists? They're not journalists themselves, right? You've heard that nonsense argument. Media, the whole idea of media institutions is going away. It's funny because I got invited on Clubhouse by a couple of people saying, hey, would you like to appear in our Clubhouse show? It's at such and such time, and, we'll interview you. And I'm thinking, why do I even need to be on your show? I am a show. It's Clubhouse. As Jay-Z said, I'm not a businessman. I'm a business, man. So anyone can be a journalist. Anyone can be a business person. Anyone can be a coder or creator or entrepreneur, or thanks to blockchain land, anyone can be an investor. So this whole idea that you are a thing and you are an expert in that thing is starting to break down. Now, it breaks down most easily for things like, do you remember when you used to go to a party and someone would be the photographer, right? But now everybody's got a phone in their pocket. Everyone's a photographer. And then you would go to a party and someone was a DJ. Okay, well, now someone just plugs in their Spotify or SoundCloud. You could still have a DJ if you want a particular vibe, but you don't need them for the music anymore. So the same way, those professions sort of went away because they were very easily democratized. And I think journalism is very much in the crosshairs for that kind of thing. Even if you credential a journalist, there's no real objective knowledge that a journalist has to develop or display to get the tag of journalist or the seal of journalism. So everyone will be a journalist, just like everyone's a DJ and everyone's a photographer and everyone's a political expert. And these days, everyone's an epidemiologist.
I do think Camille raises a really important question, though. And Naval, you actually said something that I thought was really interesting about Scott Alexander, which is this idea that, the New York Times potentially used a nuclear bomb against infantrymen. And this idea that it takes a really strong individual to be able to go against institutions. And actually, as I was reading kind of the counterpoint today from the New York Times and then his piece that he wrote in response, I was reminded of the story of Galileo. And since we have Lorenzo the Magnificent as an avatar in this room, maybe I can bring it up. But Galileo is an example of an individual who was actually very weak during his time. And of course, there's museums, and we all know who he is. But compared to the Catholic Church during his time, he capitulated twice and then ended his life in house arrest. And I kept on thinking of that story when I was reading the retort from Scott Alexander, because it was sort of a plea for peace. It wasn't this sort of, I'm going after you and I'm going to retort against everything you've said. It was sort of this retreat into house arrest in many ways. And so I do think that, when we say that institutions are going to be, defeated by individuals, we have to be mindful that takes a really, really strong individual that has to fight, and that a lot of people don't have the will to fight. And they might be brilliant, and it must be 200 years later in history that people are apologizing to them because they were right. But in our own modern times, it takes a really strong personality to be able to keep up against institutions.
It's almost certainly a coalition of individuals as opposed to any one individual.
But Catherine, the great thing is that Scott is not under house arrest, right? Quite the opposite. He's actually, in my opinion, he's stronger now than ever before. He's eliminated this weakness that he had of the real name issue. It's not a problem for him anymore. He must have more subscribers than he ever has had before. He now has paying subscribers, right? So he now has an income from his work. I mean, as far as I see it, this is a victory for the.
Well, there's a slight hit. His work will forever now be seen through the prism of the culture war. It's like really it's unfortunate because he was not that, but the New York Times made him that in a sort of.
Yeah, the New York Times is firing a lot of bullets, and every time they fail to kill someone, they just make them stronger, right? And they're creating kind of it's like if you take tanks and you roll them against infantrymen long enough and you keep blowing them up, what happens? They turn to terrorists. Then they start going behind the lines wearing suicide vests, and that'll eventually happen. So yeah, it's ugly for the individuals involved, and I think everyone in this room has either been canceled, will be canceled, should be canceled, or there'll be an attempted cancellation, right? So the only way out is just cancel yourself. Just give up on this idea that all of society is going to respect you and you're going to say something interesting at the same time, right? If you're going to say anything interesting, you're going to make enemies. It's the nature of the beast. We're learning the tactics of resilience. By the way, there's some alternative social network to Twitter that somebody set up, and they were bemoaning on there like, hey, how come all the top accounts that are followed in Techland are all these center right people? And it's like, well, because if you look at all the leftists, like, they own all the media arms, right? They literally run the country right now, and all of media already reports to them. So if you want to find interesting people, individuals, they tend to end up being center right because they get canceled out of the leftist culture. And if they're too far right, then nobody wants to follow them because then it gets tainted with all the horrible stuff, that extremists do. So it's the people who are popular in political culture today as individual brands are mostly center right, and I don't think that's a coincidence. It just shows what the structure of power is like right now.
Yeah, I think I've been thinking about it a lot in terms of just authority and anti-authority, and this is like the most popular intellectuals are typically, or thinkers or whatever, they're typically speaking about new things, and that's always going to be sort of at odds with authority at some level. One thing I've worried about recently, so there was this recent case, I don't want to drag the name in because I don't want to make this like crazy harassment chat, but let's say that a journalist gets some facts wrong publicly, reports something that's totally inaccurate. Right now, if that person works at a large institution, there still is, listen, institutions like the New York Times, for example, they get things wrong all the time. But there is still some institutional pressure there to correct facts, especially in a high-profile case. And so I'm thinking, like, you have someone who gets the facts wrong. For example, I don't know, says someone, like, let's just say, said a slur if they didn't say. In a world of just all independent writers, all working for Substack, this is sort of like all versus all world where we're all media companies, no one's ever going to, very few people are going to go out and sort of correct the facts at that point. In fact, their incentives are in the opposite direction. And we're just getting to a place, I'm looking ahead, and I see a really scary information, like an eternal information war where no one is.
Yeah, but what's the
alternative? You can't trust anyone.
Yeah, well, but that's always been the case. It's just that before it's been funneled through a few organs of power that have gotten to set the tone, and now you just realize, actually, I got to do my own homework. If I want to understand truth, if we don't want to talk falsely now, right, going back to the title, truth-seeking is a difficult business. If truth-seeking were easy, everybody would have it, and there would be no advantage to it. But truth-seeking is a very difficult business because we're always trying to fool each other for control, for power. We're also always trying to fool ourselves to make ourselves feel better, right? That's the whole ego game. So most of the life that we live, ironically, is falsehoods. Like, people ask me, they say, hey, what percentage of things that you want to tweet do you actually tweet? The answer is like 1%, okay? Because 9% of it, like, people are not ready to handle, or maybe I'm completely wrong on it, but I just feel like society is the set of consensus hallucinations we agree to, the false beliefs that we agree to, so we can all get along, so we don't kill each other, right?
I agree. That there's something useful in that, I think. And I'm worried about a world without that hallucination, without that sort of collective hallucination. Or at least
This is true. Like, for a very simple example is, you look at the Declaration of Independence. I think that's a document where it starts off and says, all men are created equal. Really? Anyone taking a genetics class, are we actually exactly the same? No, we're all different, right? Everyone's different in so many ways. You're not born into equal circumstances. You're not born into equal health. You're not born with equal parents. You're not born with, equal. It's like a Dungeons and Dragons game. As you roll the dice, someone got the intelligence, someone got the dexterity, someone else got the wisdom, right? But a way more complex version of that with millions of genes interacting. So there's the beginning foundational lie to society, right? Another one is that someone owns a piece of land. Well, okay, your great-great-great-grandfather got there with a gun first under a certain regime, and we want to uphold that regime or all of society collapses. So we'll go ahead with this fiction that you own this piece of land and that I can't set foot on it, right? So there's another big lie that is important to make society work. Anyway, I'm reinforcing your point. There are certain lies that you need to make society work.
Let me riff on this and just have a different take. I think there are real objective problems that we have that institutions, have solved, and that if all of our institutions collapse and we just and everything is now decentralized and distributed, and all of our institutions lose their authority and credibility, like those, that authority and credibility was solving a real problem, which now we need to solve in some other way, right? How do people know who to listen to? How do people know who to trust, right?
Well, people split up.
People
split up, right? Isn't that what Twitter's been doing to the rest of the world? It's been causing the Arab Spring, so maybe it's time for the American Spring, where we decide, okay, you like those sets of people and those sets of beliefs, and we like this sets of people and this sets of belief. Imagine if like hardcore Catholic Christians from 500 years ago and militant Muslims were living next to each other this whole time, and they didn't know because they were nicely divided along certain fault lines like rivers and media organizations, and they went to different schools, different churches, different everything, and now all of a sudden they find out, oh, actually we're all neighbors, and we all call ourselves Americans. No, we're the real Americans. You're obviously fake. And I think social media is accelerating this. Remember, even talk radio is responsible for, I hate to bring this up, but almost genocides, right? In Rwanda, with the, I'm going to mess this up, with the, someone tell me, the Hutus and the Tutsis. That's right. Yeah, they basically attacked each other at the behest of radio show hosts, right? At least that's how it's organized. So social media is way more powerful than that. I told Paul this. He's not going to love me saying this out loud, but I think the next Hitler and the next Gandhi could both show up in Clubhouse. It's the perfect medium for them. If you're Martin Luther King and you want to launch a revolution, you show up in Clubhouse. But at the same time, if you're one of the so-called baddies, if you're the next Osama bin Laden, you show up in Clubhouse. Humans talking to other humans is the easiest and fastest way to communicate, to build a flash mob. Actually, so this is one of my hypotheses. One of my hypotheses about Clubhouse is it's actually not that important to have a lot of followers, because there's a mobbing effect in Clubhouse that is not present on Twitter. You can see at any given point on Clubhouse which is the most interesting conversation going on. It's the largest one, right? Or where all your friends are. So you can flash mob much faster, and then you get much more context with the speaker because they're saying a lot of things. They're not just saying one thing at a time, one 280 character limited thing. So you can stick around for quite a while. So, for example, if Martin Luther King showed up on Clubhouse right now, all of Clubhouse would immediately be listening to that. Of course, there's a 5K max in the room, so let's get past that for a second. But assuming they scale it, everybody would just be listening to him, to the most compelling speaker, talking about the most compelling topic. It doesn't matter if he came with 0 followers or not. So Clubhouse, in that sense, is far more meritocratic. Although meritocratic doesn't mean good, it just means like efficient at routing resources to the person best to play in the system. The Clubhouse is the most meritocratic of the social networks to date. You don't need to spend a lot of time building up a following. You can just show up. And so I think the Clubhouse will move flash mobs and move large groups of people much faster than any social network before it. So when they take the invite gate off this thing, that's when I say you get ready for the real dislocation of society. And I think we need to end up as at least 2 nations. I don't know how that happens. I don't know if it I don't know if it happens in a decade or 100 years or 5 years. I don't know if it's a war. I don't know if it's geographic. I don't know if it's cultural. I don't know if it's, based on some other system. I don't know if it's VR space. I just know that these people don't want to be living together. Now, the counterpoint to all this, because I could be completely wrong, right? The counterpoint to this is actually certain forms of technology bring us closer together. In a weird way, talking to people, you can only disagree with them so much. Like if I'm talking to you right now and you're talking back to me, I can't call you a name. I can't make an indefensible ad hominem attack and then disappear, or at least it'll come across pretty badly. So the conversational element, which is much more human, connects us emotionally and hopefully stops this thing about where on Twitter we're very comfortable just assaulting somebody, body checking them in a way that we never would in another medium. I think we've all had this experience where you send an email and it gets misinterpreted because you can't put emotional content in email. So if you ever try and solve any emotional problem via email, like for example, you're writing a letter to your lover, like don't leave me, it doesn't work. It's going to be way more effective. It's most effective if you talk in person. Second most effective, at least you talk on the phone. And you send it through any text-based medium, and it's going to get misinterpreted and mangled. So the same way, I think that Clubhouse can actually bring people together much more than a pure text-based medium. While at the same time, it does provide this instant flash mobbing capability for ideologues, good and bad, that did not exist really on the internet before. So I think whatever the trend that is going on, Clubhouse is going to have a huge impact on it. Clubhouse will change society. And I'm not saying this necessarily good or bad, it's just a thing, and it's coming.
Well, let me give a vote for the latter hypothesis that the Clubhouse and the decentralization of just human communication away from the media is going to give more ability for us to find our basic human connection. I like the idea. I forget what the year is. Is it like 1913 that Freud, Hitler, and Stalin all lived in Vienna at the same time? And, of course, they didn't have Clubhouse to communicate, and it's very possible that the division that ultimately then resulted in World War II and some of the greatest atrocities of the 20th century could have been stopped if we had the distributed technology of Clubhouse. On this note, I want to say Happy Valentine's Day, because I think it is February 14th, to all the lovebirds out there. So I do hope love wins on this one.
Can I co-sign that briefly? I agree with Lex. I think the second half of Naval's presentation is probably the one that's right. And I also, Mike, I don't share your concern whatsoever with respect to us finding ways back to like common shared truths. I mean, credibility is a commodity. People are going to specialize in that. And I think for precisely that reason, even with the decentralization, a lot of folks are going to float towards certain polls, and they will be hugely influential. And whatever the new media ecosystem is, even if there are more of those polls, it'll still be somewhat limited, and it'll take some time for folks to build up credibility. It isn't the case that there is, 1,000 different truths. There are some polls, and there are reasons why we're having some unique difficulties, which I think we talked about a little bit earlier. But I'm certainly optimistic about what the media environment is going to look like in a couple of years.
Yeah, but I think nobody cares about credibility. Not even people who say they care about credibility care about credibility. Those people tend to care about the aesthetic of credibility. People just want to listen to what makes them feel good. And as Naval was talking about, I mean, this is a great app for that. You're going to have all sorts of ideologues. One thing I'm worried about is like, is there even such a thing as a good ideologue? Should anybody have direct access to 300 million people at any given moment of the day or 24 hours a day? That decision was before. But that decision was. But Mike, it's too late. Like that decision was made when the first TCP/IP packet launched across the globe. I'm not saying to undo it. I don't think anything good. I think that there are all sorts of negative externalities that we're about to see sort of coming our way, and I'm nervous about them.
I think humans given the choice will always given options. Humans will always choose. I want what's best for myself. Right. Ultimately, we're all kind of rationally selfish creatures who are trying to survive and replicate. We're, moist robots or biological machines that are built to do that. So we're each optimizing for what we think is best for us, right? And so as time goes on, everyone wants to exercise choice. The reason why people want money is so they have the freedom of choosing where to live and how to live and not having to do things they don't want to do, right? And the same way, the reason people want civil liberties and human liberties is so that they can live the life that they want. So I think turning everyone into a journalist doesn't actually mean that they end up more hive-like. It doesn't mean that they, march off a cliff necessarily because some ideologue is demanding it. I think they much more embrace individuality. And what's going to happen is we are clustered into organizations against our choice, against our will, that are starting to get unbundled. Like one example is religion. Maybe you were born Christian and, 300 years ago you'd have to stay Christian. But now you decide, no, I'm going to change. I'm going to become Buddhist, or I'm going to become atheist, or whatever. That was a choice that recently became available. The same way, right now we're all bundled into American, or we're all bundled into we have to believe in capitalism. And I think people are going to start unbundling and making choices. The only sin is coercion. The only sin is forcing other people to behave the way you want them to behave. As long as it's a peaceful society and, people are free to come and go, this will sort itself out. Now, we actually aren't that, of course, because people do want to coerce each other for their own good. But I think that the urge to coerce other people for their own good is actually the source of evil. So when you basically, think about, well, those people are idiots. They're going to follow Hitler off a cliff, but I'm not. So I better control the situation. I better make sure they don't listen to the next Hitler. That's where the evil starts, trying to control them in the first place. Because given their own devices, they just want freedom to determine outcomes for their own life. I don't think I grew up in some bad neighborhoods. I've met some people in bad situations. I don't think I've ever met a truly evil person, okay? I know they exist, like there's serial killers and child molesters and so on, but they're quite rare. The vast majority of people are trying to do the right thing. They're trying to get by. They're trying to have some freedom. They're trying to have some love. They're trying to have some health. They're trying to take care of the people that they love. And usually when you dig down as to why they're doing something, they're always doing it for somebody else. It's very rare to find a truly selfish person, but everybody thinks everybody else is selfish. And so it's because you see evil in the heart of somebody else and you decide you have to stop them, you have to coerce them. That is the beginning of evil. So I choose to be an optimist because I think most people are good and trying to be good and do the right thing within the parameters of their own survival and replication. And I think that given more choices, including the ability to have conversations and followers and so on, I think they will find the right way out of the current institutions and the current bundles that we're in, which were built for a different society, which were built for a pre-social media society. That said, it will be dislocated. People will get hurt.
Yeah, I hear you, and I think I agree about our nature is to be good, and we pursue goodness and connection. And on a long enough time frame, I think we're all kind of the mind that these systems and institutions will rebuild and could rebuild in greater form. I'm also thinking back to what Mark mentioned earlier about turning to nihilism. And I think that's the biggest concern that I have, that it's much easier to destroy things and build things down than it is to rebuild them and to have good concrete visions of new things. I'm just concerned about the turnaround time.
Well, for better or for worse, building new things it doesn't need to come from a lot of people. Because we have leverage through technology, only a small number of people need to actually build things, which is not great for society in other ways, because then they amass all the wealth and get the new robber barons. But, play along with the mental model for a second. So imagine we created a company that was just really good at stamping out basic housing, right? All it did was you basically gave this thing a pile of dirt, and they have a machine and they have a process that will, for like $1,000, stamp out a basic, decent quality house, right? So this machine could cheaply print. It's not quite 3D print because you're not doing it layer by layer, but it could assemble and build huge amounts of housing stock and take care of the quote-unquote homeless problem. Not really, because the homeless problem is really a drug abuse and a mental illness problem. It's actually not a housing problem. That's secondary. But just play along with me. So you could do the same thing for food. You could do the same thing for basic healthcare. Obviously at some level you need humans involved, and that has a cost, but you could have robots and so on. So I think we can start having a small number of people build things that then mass produce for the rest of society and kind of take care of it. I'm not saying it's a wonderful society, right? That's a little bit of an Eloy and Morlocks kind of society. So you also have to make sure that people have other outlets, right? The bold case is that they all create art, right? Or study science or literature or what have you. The bear case is they just smoke weed and play video games all day. Yeah. And unfortunately, I think, current evidence shows that we're more headed in the latter. But, humans want to be creative. Even all the people who are sitting there and smoking weed and playing video games, what are they actually doing? Well, they're smoking weed because they don't have something bigger to go out there and build. So they're just trying to stun their brain with submission to keep it quiet, to take it away from kind of their daily lack of purpose. And then video games are a shadow career. The amount of time people spend getting good at video games, they could have gone and built a business.
Totally. So, when I talk about building, to be clear, I don't actually mean building things materially. I think without question, we can materially build. I'm talking more about what rebuilds our trust in institutions and our narratives about what dignity comes from and looks like. And to Mark's point about nihilism and the ability to rip things down faster than perhaps we can rebuild them, that's my larger concern. And I think
what's the big wave sweeping Silicon Valley, right? In addition to, Silicon Valley is cutting edge in a bunch of ways. And by Silicon Valley, I mean the tech industry, not just the physical place. But a lot of people are into, spirituality, or they're going to Burning Man. They're looking for other sources of meaning and trust and connection, right? So we're naturally religious creatures. And if we don't have a single authoritarian religion bearing down on us, we'll create our own religion, right? And even atheism is a kind of a form of religion. It's a set of beliefs around which you structure your life. Because at the end of the day, nothing is knowable other than the fact that you exist. That's literally it. And by exist, I mean just that you're aware, not even that your body exists. For all you know, you could be in the Matrix or in a VR helmet or a simulation or a brain in a vat. So at some level, you do have to have an axiomatic belief system on which to base the rest of reality. You don't even know if the next second is necessarily going to be like the last second, or the laws of physics will be consistent. So there are certain axioms we all have to believe. And for whatever reason, we as humans, actually, most of us choose to believe axioms beyond that, because we also have to function culturally with each other. So you enter classic religion, which is like this cultural operating system that's layered onto groups of us so that we can cooperate and thrive. And so I think humans are naturally trust-seeking and community-building creatures. And even if the community of being American is yanked away from them, or the community of being Christian is yanked away from them, I think they will create new communities, and they will create new institutions, and they will create new cultures. But these will be opt-in cultures. People at Burning Man, I've noticed at Burning Man, for those of you who've been, I see a lot of people go there and like, what are they doing? They're actually they keep talking about tribe. I'm trying to create a tribe. I want my tribe. That's my tribe. What they really want is chosen family, right? So the old model was you're born in a family, you're born in a tribe, you have your uncles, cousins, great uncles, aunts, sisters, whatever, and you kind of have to just get along with them. They're chosen for you. You don't choose them. But they give you a set of stability, but they also lock you in. Now you're stuck where you grew up and born, and you're stuck in that job, and you're stuck taking care of people, and you have to behave a certain way. But you have the love and the warmth and the protection and the support and the trust of a tight-knit tribe. Now people are creating their own tribes, chosen tribes, right? We went through this period that I would say culturally was very dislocated, where we went from big families to nuclear families to single moms to, now every person is it for themselves. It's all about Tinder and, who can get away with what in a relationship. But I think we're going back to now people seeking tribal connections. People are looking to live next to each other. People are looking to form their own communities. And media and phones actually allow us to do that. You can now go visit your far-flung friends. You can stay on Airbnb. You can catch up with them on Zoom or Clubhouse. So people are re-knitting back these tribes. So I think people will find their way back to institutions that are healthier. They'll be chosen opt-in institutions. Who do I trust? Who do I spend time with? Who do I love? Who's going to take care of my kid? Which kind of hospital do I go to? But we do have to go through this period where the easy answers are all broken up, right? It's not just going to be Harvard and Kaiser and New York Times. It may end up being actually, primer for homeschooling, and for journalism, it's these 7 accounts and these 3 Substacks. And for my banking, I'm actually going to use Coinbase. So you just have to rethink it through. But each individual is reassembling a stack for themselves that they are much more aligned towards, and is a chosen stack as opposed to one that is pushed down on them from above.
I mean, I think another really interesting sort of shift is people are able to invest the way they want to, right? Where I think sort of the GameStop stuff is probably an example, but generally I think there's a shift towards not only are people able to pick the media that they get to consume, but they get to allocate their capital, the stimulus check, right? They get to do whatever they want with that $1,200. That's very different than giving it to a pension fund that might give it to a fund of funds that might give it to Andreessen, that might give it to Clubhouse, right? And I think that is like Tesla, Amazon. I think that's going to be really a really interesting shift as well. Is like that people will be able to decide, who gets to spend their money and invest their money.
Yeah, and on a long enough time frame. Again, I think this is perfectly valid. I do think that there's something real in authority, even if that authority is really illegible right now, and the powers that be are pretty illegible to us. I don't think that there's nothing happening there. And I think it might take us a really long time to figure out how to rebuild that same sense of authority and legitimacy in a digital context. And
Well,
I'm curious if you disagree.
No, not disagree. There's always dislocations with technology changes, right? So printing press caused huge dislocations. Social media is going to cause huge dislocations. It's going to be rough. But who was it? I think maybe it was Alan Kay. I don't know. Somebody famously said that the future is already here. It's just unevenly distributed, right? So we still have people like us on Clubhouse talking about sovereign individual type futures 20 years out, even for us, at the kind of their full level, or at least at a level where it outstrips the institutions that surround us today, and compare that to people who are probably living on a couple of dollars a day, or the farmers protesting in India about farm bill changes, right? So there's still a very, very, very wide gap, and those gaps are very, very dislocative. It's a weird world. I mean, there's the recent round of the Federal Reserve printing, what was it, $8 trillion or something on that order, $2 trillion this year, and then $6 trillion the year before, or whatever. I might have the numbers wrong, so don't quote me on that, but it's a lot of money, right? All of that money printing, well, it goes to the banks, Cantillon effect, if you look that up and just Google that, and then it drops down from there into companies and into large institutions that then send it off into assets, and so sorry if I back up for a second. We printed so much money that we're widening the wealth gap at this point, right? Because that money goes to the rich people first, and a lot of it flees into assets because it's afraid of inflation. So industries that should have been wiped out, like cruise ships and airlines and hotels, are still around. Housing markets that should have been wiped out, like urban area in New York, for at least certain parts of it, they're still afloat. But the things that weren't wiped out, that shouldn't have been wiped out, like tech, for example, or crypto, are booming because now we've raised the water level. So the things that were going to drown are now above the water line, but the things that started above the water line were going to stay above the water line, now up in the stratosphere. They've skyrocketed. So there's all this money that is now flowing into, yes, it's a good time as an individual investor, but these individual investors are also scared. They're running. They're taking the money, the free money that they got, and they're starting to put it in things where they think it's going to be a safe haven. I don't know how this experiment ends, but there's a commonality here going back to the New York Times. The New York Times is taking credibility that it built up over 100 years, and it's squandering it by smearing people like Scott Alexander. The same way, the United States is taking the reserve currency status that it locked in and solidified over the last 50 years, and is testing that reserve currency status. It's squandering some of that reputation. Now, it probably still has a long ways to go, but 70% of all dollars are held by foreigners, or at least were when I looked at the stat about a year ago. And so every time we print money, that means 70% of the dilution is borne by foreigners. That's an exorbitant privilege. And we're basically going to get away with that by monetizing our deficits and thereby bailing out our economy no matter what our policies are. But at some point, that reserve currency status will come under threat. And if that does, it's a long ways down because there's no coming back from that. Anyway, we achieved the main goal I had for this room. The main goal I had for this room was to have a conversation with some people that I didn't know that well, who were really interesting, and to also hit the same number as Elon in listeners. So I've got my wish. I hit 5K, and I'm calling Elon my even, and I'm probably going to go out on that. So I'll hand the room off to you guys. Have a great time, and have a good night.
Bye, Naval.
I don't think we had an overflow like streaming YouTube channel for this room, though, unfortunately. So I don't know if we quite.